Good evening. Your Excellency, the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, Honorable Ministers of Transport of Tuvalu, the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tuvalu, the Honorable Minister of Environment of Dominica, even Mcdonald, the co-chair of the Green Climate Fund Board, the panelists here at the high table, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this high-level event, political, that is the GCF and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. We're here to gauge the implementation, the opportunities towards the implementation of the Paris Agreement in both adaptation and mitigation. And we have the goals of this event to see how we can share cross-cutting experiences from countries, entities that are currently deploying GCF financing. We want to enhance joint learning by showcasing countries and entities projects. And we also want to hear from you on the vision of the GCF to set up an ambitious challenge of serving the Paris Agreement. I now have the honor to introduce the co-chair of the GCF board, Mr. Mcdonald, who would deliver the opening remarks. Ewan, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Pa, and good evening, everyone. And can I firstly acknowledge, Pa, the work of the Secretariat this week in setting up this event and the many events that are being put together. So thank you very much to you and the Secretariat. And I'd also very much like to welcome all of your excellencies, distinguished panellists who I've got on the stage here with me, and participants for this side event. And I'd like to also very much acknowledge the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, and in particular the Prime Minister's ongoing leadership, not only on the Green Climate Fund, but on climate per se. And it's great to have you here, Prime Minister, with all your other commitments that you have. I also want to acknowledge very much the ministers from Transport and Foreign Affairs from Tuvalu. It's great to see you here as well as, of course, the Minister for the Environment from Dominica. Very much welcome to you as well. And I think it's terrific to see at this, as I call it, Prime Minister Pacific COP, to see such great representation here from the ministers. I'd also like to just talk a little bit about the Green Climate Fund in my opening remarks, and people will probably be familiar that I've chaired the fund for 3 of its 5 years in existence, and I'm particularly pleased with where the fund has progressed to this year. And I think in the opening remarks we gave to the COP last Wednesday about the performance of the fund, I think it was quite illuminating in terms of what's been achieved by the Secretariat and the board. And as you know, the Green Climate Fund is an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the Convention and continues to make efforts to respond to parties as it plays its key role in channeling climate action and finance to developing countries. And you'll know that it's talked about a lot about paradigm shifting and being ambitious, and that's what we'd like to achieve. And I think we've got some good examples tonight that'll give you a good flavour of some of the projects that are coming through. And of course it has a key role to play in the Paris Agreement and the NDCs in relation to the implementation of those, and of course support for adaptation planning. And the Prime Minister and I were just talking about the adaptation project in Tuvalu. And as I said earlier, the GCF has made great progress in my view this year, and I think I'd like to update you on some of those important key achievements. So we've worked very much around increasing capacity and addressing the capacity needs of countries in an expedited manner. And under the GCF Readiness Program, which many of you will be familiar with, we've provided $41.8 million to countries to support 130 requests for assistance. 92, or 2/3 of those, come from LDCs, SIDS and African states. And at our last board meeting in October, we approved an additional $50 million to help the growing number of requests to help formulate national adaptation plans or voluntary adaptation planning process. The fund has so far approved $2.6 billion of program resources for, as I said earlier, the implementation of ambitious and paradigm-shifting action. The board has approved a total of 54 climate projects and, as I said, $2.65 billion, and programs to be implemented in 73 countries as a result of those projects. This means that this year we've doubled the number and more than doubled the value of approved GCF funding reported to the COP last year. And 14 of the GCF's approved funding proposals have come through the private sector facility, and interestingly, the private sector facility and the public proposals are equal at $1.3 billion each. And interestingly, that $1.3 billion of private sector funding is expected to mobilise billions of dollars for climate action as a result. I'm also happy to report that we now have a majority of direct access entities, and many of you will know that direct access is a key feature of the fund. And just having, of those 59 accredited entities, 32 of them are direct access, and they're continuing to increase at a quick progress. In addition, the majority of accredited entities have now finalised their master agreements with the GCF, ensuring funding can now flow. And many of you will know that the dispersion of money has been one of the issues, and they've been held up as a result of the accredited master agreements not being signed off. Well, we now, and I thank very much Howard Bamsey as the ED and his team here in the Secretariat, we've now got accredited master agreements in place for all projects. So all projects now have that, and of the 54 approved, 18 are being implemented, of which $150 million has already been dispersed, and another 450 will quickly hit the ground soon. So we'll end up with very quickly $600 million dispersed as a result of the work that's been done this year by the Secretariat, and I really want to acknowledge that work. Also, in terms of those disbursements, certainly at the moment, as I said, 150 compared with less than 10 at this time last year. The other thing I wanted to mention was that following more than a decade of hard work by the parties here at the UNFCCC, it was a delight to report that at the last board meeting, the GCF took solid steps on the mandate around RED+ and into concrete action. And we allocated $500 million towards a request for proposals for a pilot RED+ results-based payments. And those of you who may have seen the board meeting saw the applause that rang out after that was actually agreed. And again, I want to acknowledge the hard work of members of the board and members of the Secretariat. And the Prime Minister and I were just talking about Faturi, Ambassador Faturi, who's part of our board, and he's been very much pushing a simplified approval process. And he was very pleased also at the last board meeting for that to be approved in pilot form and allocating $80 million of financing for that. So in seeking to enhance GCF support for technology, the board has also mandated development of a request for proposals to support climate technology incubators and accelerators. Finally, on the strengthening of the operational framework, a series of decisions have also been taken this year that will strengthen the operations of the fund and help generate high-quality funding proposals in the future. The board considered lessons learned from the initial 5 rounds of funding and proposals and endorsed a number of actions to improve that proposal approval process. And I want to acknowledge a number of you and others have commented on the need for simplifying and making more accessible our processes around that. And the board also agreed, as a result of that, a set of new policies and guidelines to strengthen the scale of the fund's pipeline of proposals. And drawing also on the experience from those initial rounds, these actions will help generate high-quality funding proposals in the future and, of course, contribute to the paradigm shift required to implement the Paris Agreement goals. So let me conclude by acknowledging very much the opportunity I've had over the last 2 years to co-chair with both South Africa and Saudi Arabia, Ayman Shazli and Sahir Vakir, and the considerable progress that's been made during that time. The fund is now truly operational and delivering on its mandate, including supporting the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And it's interesting to think back just 2 years. 2 years ago, this fund was not operational. So in 2 years, we've approved 54 projects and $2.65 billion of funding. I'm very pleased now to learn and hear from the panellists here about the experiences that they've had and the learning that we can all take from that experience, and I very much look forward to working with you all into the future. Thank you very much, Pa.
Thank you very much for those remarks, and thank you for your leadership. I mean, I think it is through your leadership that you've steered the board and guiding the Secretariat towards all these achievements that you have elaborated here, and we look forward to your further guidance, despite the fact that you're going to hand over, but we think you would still be looking up to us and then providing us with any guidance you think is relevant to really pursue the objective of the Paris Agreement and guiding us to achieve our objectives. I now have the honor of calling on the Prime Minister of Tuvalu to give us the perspective of Tuvalu in the implementation of the programs with the country. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pa, and I want first of all to thank you and also the Executive Director of GCF now, Howard Barmsey. Thank you for the arrangements and also for kindly inviting me and my members of my Tuvalu delegation to be here. Let me also echo my sincere thanks to the co-chair of the GCF board, Mcdonald. Thank you for his leadership, as you've said, and we are so happy. Tuvalu is very happy that the fund is finally operational, and that the work that the fund, through the leadership of co-chairman Mcdonald, has been very exemplary for how a financing mechanism should respond to the requirements of the issues of effects of climate change, particularly adaptation. So thank you very much for your leadership, Your Excellency, Co-Chairman. I also want to acknowledge at the beginning the work of the Tuvalu and SITS representative in the board of the GCF, Ambassador Feturi Risaya, because his work there in the board over the past 2 years has been, I think, very, very critical and very pivotal to making sure access and particularly SITS access into the Green Climate Fund is ensured in the procedural and the guidelines for the fund. So I want to acknowledge my sincere thanks to Ambassador Turi and also to the government of Samoa for allowing the services of our colleague in the United Nations in New York to take us through. Now, on the question that you have asked, I am particularly pleased at this, again, opportunity, COP23, to come to the side event of the Green Climate Fund. Yes, indeed, because we believe the mechanism, the GCF, is a central measure with which we can make sure the Paris Agreement, but particularly the objective of the convention of our work, knowing that our work should be guided by Article 2 of the Convention on Climate Change. Paris Agreement is only further implementing that convention, and I want to lock our discussions and our way forward on the requirements and the vision of Article 2. It says the danger level of human interventions into the climate of the world. And that requires mitigation, immediate mitigation to the level that is not dangerous to humankind, and also the need to adapt, particularly to help those most vulnerable. So I think the mechanism, the Green Climate Fund, is a very, very important tool that we need to give support and need to provide leadership as well, so that it works to the benefit of those most vulnerable. Hence, I have brought to COP23 a big delegation. Of course, Ambassador Mcdonald has referred to ministers from Tuvalu, transport, dealing with shipping and aviation Tuvalu, foreign affairs. But I also have, besides the government representation, brought with me representatives of community in Tuvalu, of the island community of Funafuti, who is there with representation from the communities themselves. And the reason is that to show that this is not a matter for the government only to work to respond to climate change. It has to be inclusive. In Tuvalu, we are doing just that. And I'm also happy to say that amongst my delegation is also the leader of the opposition of parliament, and to show that we work together. And I don't know whether he's going to be a leader of the opposition after this conference or not. And I'm not trying to conspire on that. But equally to show that Tuvalu has full trust and respect on the goodwill that is forthcoming from the international community. And for that, I want to extend the thanks and a great appreciation of my people of Tuvalu, particularly the communities, the government, and NGOs of Tuvalu. Thank you for your support. And the reason I'm emphasizing that, we have now got approval of funding of 52 million Australian dollars to help Tuvalu develop its Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project from the Green Climate Fund. And I'm so proud that it is the first funding that has been dispersed for in the Pacific Small Island Developing States. And thank you very much, Co-Chairman Mcdonald and the board members as well as the GCF. So, at the end of this conference, I'm going back to Tuvalu, and I'm going to host the first meeting of the board, the steering board, for operationalizing or implementing the activities under the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Fund. So I really want to thank you for your support. So therefore, it is a pleasure for me because the chiefs that I have included, or reps of the community in my delegation, come from one of the islands, the capital island of Tuvalu, Funafuti, who is going to be direct beneficiary of this funding. and we are developing plans to build sea walls and coastal protection measures going to protect these islands from the onslaught of sea level rise and other effects of climate change. Also included in that respect, I have the Minister of Transport, who is also coming from one recipient of that funding in Tuvalu, Nanumanga, and I think he's very happy. I think he will be elected again in the next elections of Tuvalu. But this is to show how serious and how important we treat these interventions and goodwill from the international community. Therefore, I think we, vulnerable countries, we need to work hard here in COP23 to advance the work of the GCF, because we believe it should be continued. There are issues about the gap of funding that have been discussed. There are issues about looking at the operational mechanisms of the fund, but I think we all are in the learning curve. We know perfect is always the enemy of the good, but we must strive and work. It has to be a two-way system. We have to help as well as benefiting. Therefore, it is also my belief that given the funding gap that is unfolding and some parties are dragging the feet in terms of funding, I think it makes every sense for us perhaps to concretize and look at the possibility of bringing the adaptation fund, for example, to serve the Paris Agreement as well. It is my strong view that we need to do that here in COP23. Perhaps looking also at the possibility of the Special Climate Change Fund, the LDC funds that are housed under the Global Environmental Facility. Because I think bringing these all in one house will improve the coordination and particularly the delivery of this support to countries, particularly the most vulnerable countries like those small islands in the Pacific and all regions of the world. And I certainly call on support for us to make a decision here, for the COP to make a decision here, so that the Adaptation Fund is approved or shall serve the Paris Agreement. The other issue that I wanted to raise up in my intervention is references to other issues like the loss and damage. Because although we've got funding now for adaptation, it will not probably serve the concerns under the loss and damage, because the loss and damage is beyond adaptation. It is to provide for those countries like small island countries like Tuvalu, when you are left with nothing to adapt to, when your land area is completely eroded into the ocean. You've got to have measures from the international community to help these people survive. And I would ask that we support as well that the loss of damage be retained in the COP and its body's processes. We cannot take this out of our work. Our work here is to walk the talk of the Paris Agreement, and we must therefore implement the Paris Agreement, not start with proposals to take this out, because this is a recipe for danger. It's a recipe for the demise of the loss and damage. So therefore, without further adding on, I think I have said what I need to say at the beginning, and again to acknowledge the good work of the GCF. I close by saying, yes, we appreciate this is a Pacific COP. 23 is Pacific COP. We appreciate it very much. But let's islandize the work of COP23. The islands are suffering. They are going underwater, as we have seen in the Caribbean. How long more do we want to wait? How many islands do we need to see going under the sea in order to take actions on mitigation, especially on cutting down on emissions. Therefore, my call here, we must together act now. We cannot wait to quantify or qualify the 1.5 degrees or whatever figure we put. These are just indicative. We must act now to reduce emissions and cap it right now, because the further we delay, the more suffering the island countries will have. So therefore, we cannot have an island COP if decisions here are dragged to allow 2 more years or 3 more years to wait for actions. We cannot do that. And it is totally unacceptable to Tuvalu. Therefore, I call for the support of parties here. Let's together do it now. Actions on mitigation, actions on funding. Keep the coal in the ground. Let's move to renewable energy. Save the islands like Tuvalu in order to save the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for those words. You have always been a moral voice to the world. And thank you for being very inclusive, for not only bringing the segments of the communities, but also bringing the leader of the opposition. This is a real demonstration of all inclusiveness, and this is what is in the criteria of the GCF. We want to ensure that countries drive the process, but also ensure that everybody within the country is part of the process. I would like to take this opportunity now to call on Ms. Randa Munir, the Director of GCF Unit at the Ministry of Environment of Egypt. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. I'd like to thank you all for making the time to come and listen to us today. And would like to thank the GCF, the board and the secretary for all the work and the support they've given us all through the previous years. I do have, as I've been asked, 3 to 5 minutes here to speak, so I broke my presentation into 2 parts. I don't know how to move with the slide to the next one. The clicker is, but anyway. That's fine. I will start by my first part, and I'll say thank you very much. And it's this one.
The green one.
The green one, okay. The first part, I will explain what Egypt has done to make this successful, even though we had a lot of challenges and lessons learned that I'm here to share with you today. And then the first part is I'm going to mention, I picked one of the projects that have been approved, and we still also have some other projects in the pipeline, but the one that I chose was one that has been approved by the board and the secretariat. And then the second part, I'm going to share the lessons learned through that experience, and then the challenges and the room for opportunities. What can we do to make this better? The first part, first Egypt has started establishing a non-objection procedure through a participatory consultative process, mainly the GCF National Steering Committee that included several ministries, such as the Ministry of Investment, Ministry of Environment, Agriculture, Energy. The reason we did that is to have the approval and the priorities coming from different channels, and to communicate to have a better outcome in that process. It is comprised of representatives from different ministries, as I mentioned, the Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Investment, the international cooperation when it has to come to dealing with international entities in finance, trade, industry, and water resources and irrigation. We do have some projects that are related to agriculture and water resources, finance and planning. I guess that's one more. No, but I wanted the one before that. Yeah, this one, sorry. This is the project that we got approval for. As I mentioned, we have one for energy is on the national level, and this one I'm sharing with you here is a showcase. This is a regional one that is a program that has several countries that are benefiting from that project, and this is why I chose it here. It does have an impact and innovative elements that are related and totally linked to the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is a program it is for the scaling up private sector climate finance through local financial institutions. It is the 15 beneficiary countries will benefit from this project. It comprises 200 projects under the program. Sorry, I said it's a program. It will be implemented on 15 years. The total amount for that has been approved is $1,537 million US. The finance of the co-financing would come from the GCF, from the EBRD, and from the Sustainable Energy Finance Facility, SEFF. This will ultimately reduce the emissions, increase the resilience. It includes both adaptation, mitigation, and it's a cross-cutting program. As mentioned, this program will address the full region. That includes the Middle East, North Africa, Western and Central Asia, Southern and Eastern Europe. Next is the lessons learned through this program and other projects too, whether it's the approved ones or the pipeline ones, including also the readiness and the NAP projects. So the first lesson learned was to ensure the national multi-stakeholder ownership, and this is why we formed the steering committee that included several ministries. So for example, the energy portfolio did not only include the approval of the Ministry of Energy, but as well included the approvals from the Ministry of Investment, International Cooperation, Environment, Finance, and Foreign Affairs. The next lesson learned, or the point I want to share with you here today, is a selection of accredited entities that will deliver, but also have the comparative advantage in selected areas that would maximize the impact and justify the incremental cost. Third is the ensuring a balanced approach between the line ministries, priorities that are being submitted by different ministries, and the accredited entities. A selection of accredited entity to deliver and have comparative advantage in selected areas, mainly development partners operating at the national level. The next point I wanted to share is the GCF support to countries to establish an enabling environment to secure climate finance for their national priorities. The next one is prompting the disbursement of funds for both readiness and the National Adaptation Plan programs to start establishing the enabling environment. The last point, and I would say this is an opportunity for improvement, more support is needed to package adaptation projects with clear and prompt procedures for eligibility of funds in the preparatory phase that will enable the success in the moving of the projects in a positive direction. That ends my presentation here today, and I would like to thank you for giving the time to listen to me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Randa, and Honorable Prime Minister, our co-chair of the board, Ewan, has to leave because the Minister of Australia, we know we are almost at the beginning of the high level and a lot of ministers are around. And Ewan would like to excuse us to go and join his minister. Thank you very much for joining us and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you. Let me now call on Joan Philip Coentero, the Deputy Director of Territorial and Public Investment of National Planning Department of Colombia, to give us the Latin American experience.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Juan Felipe Quintero from Colombia. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really want to thank all the GCF team. They're amazing partners, and our experience is great with them. So I'm going to share with you the key experiences that we have lived and the process that we have developed in order to engage with the GCF successfully. This process started in 2015 when the government decided to carry on an institutional coordination and to set up a collegiate body members in order to engage with the GCF. This collegiate body is led by the National Planning Department, the institution that I represent. It also the Ministry of Finance also participates, as well as the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Agency for Internal Cooperation. So that was set up in 2015. Then this body designed a country strategy. What we wanted is to have strategic goals in order to take advantage in a better way of the GCF support and funding. So in 2015, we decided and we approved the priorities in order to access the GCF funding. And we also approved the guidelines to accredited entities in Colombia. And we also set up a procedure for granting non-objection letters. This seems a little bit operational, but it's very important to have that in line. In 2016, once the strategy was set up, we started to build a project portfolio. And that included eligibility criteria. We also launched a call for proposals of projects. And the outcome was that we have already 10 projects. 6 mitigation projects and 4 adaptation projects. If we value those projects, it's around $1.2 billion. The achievements in 2017, we already have a project approved by the GCF board that is called La Mojana. That was, I think, last month in Cairo, in the meeting in Cairo. We have an NDA readiness approved. We have a NAP readiness endorsed. We have a NAMA waste readiness endorsed. And we have some pilots for financial innovation under review. And we have made sure that all the projects that we work together with the GCF are aligned to our NDC pledges. And our focus right now is to build this project portfolio and focus on implementation. The project, briefly, I will describe the project that was approved last month. It's called Scaling Up Climate Resilient Water Management Practices for Vulnerable Communities in La Mojana. La Mojana is a region composed of 11 municipalities in the north of Colombia, and they're very, very affected by extreme climate events since they live, these 400,000 people live in a wetland system. So the project looks for has 4 outputs. The first one is knowledge management and dissemination of impacts of climate change on water management planning. The output number 2 is improve early warning systems for that region. Output 3 is to promote climate resilient water resources infrastructure. And output 4 is enhance rural livelihoods through climate resilient agroecosystems. The value of the project is almost $120 million, and the GCF approved us a grant for around $39 million. The other topic I want to tell you about in this occasion is that we have an NDC of 20% emissions by 2030, and if we achieve international cooperation, the goal is to reduce 30% of emissions. We already have a gross estimate of the investment that we need to make in order to accomplish these objectives. It's around $1 billion per year. That's about 0.4% of Colombia's GDP. And the vast majority, and this is the key message, is from that financing comes from the private sector. We have estimated that 62% of the cost of achieving our NDCs comes from the private sector. Right now, we're working in some cases, as for example, massive transport systems in the main cities of Colombia. Also, we're working on some projects of ecosystem restoration, energy efficiency in buildings, and technological change in transport. Finally, I want to share with you the advances that we have made in instruments for climate finance. First, this year in 2017, we have and the country has had emissions, 3 green bond emissions this year for around $400 million. Private banks, as Bancolombia, that is the main bank in Colombia, issued an emission of 120 million. Da Vivienda, that is another private bank, 150 million. And Bancoldex, that is a development bank owned by the government, 68 million emission. Also, in last December, in the last tax reform, the government and the Congress approved a carbon tax. It's $5 per ton of CO2. It's charged only on fossil fuels, and it represents 24% of national emissions. And in that tax reform, we also specified, and the government and the Congress specified, that the revenue that comes from that carbon tax is not going to be in the national budget, but it's going to be earmarked to specific investment in environmental projects. For example, payments for environmental services and the funding of other mitigation and adaptation projects. So we not only approved the carbon tax, but we also went a step further and decided that those revenues are going to be invested only in environmental projects. And we're working very hard in order to develop an emission trading scheme. Right now we have a good progress on voluntary carbon market platform. We have incentives for neutrality from carbon tax. And that's a very aggressive topic that we're dealing with, since it represents 48% of national emissions. I really want to thank the GCF team. They're amazing partners, and we hope we continue working together in order to achieve our environmental policy goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, we are seeing really a wide spectrum of very innovative projects being funded by the GCF. I now call on Ms. Jacqueline Novogratz, the Chief Executive Officer of Acumen, to give us her perspective.
Thank you very much. And I also just want to start by saying thank you really deeply and sincerely to the board as well as the team at GCF. It's been a really fantastic partnership, and we're a little bit different. As what's been so exciting is hearing how each of these case studies is so different from one another. We're technically a nonprofit that invests long-term patient capital in entrepreneurs that are building companies that are focused on solving critical issues like energy, agriculture, health, and education. We'd been investing philanthropic capital for 10 years in the off-grid energy space when we had the insight that the market was ready for much more significant kinds of capital to help build out the off-grid solar energy sector, and that individual households were at a point where they could afford to buy home solar systems and much more. When we approached Green Climate Fund a couple of years ago with this idea for a $100 million for-profit initiative that would very specifically, and this was one of the lessons, the clear goals of reaching 15 million individuals, half of them living in poverty, giving them not just access to electricity, but electricity, and diverting 1.5 million tons of carbon, with the real objective of proving to African governments that off-grid is faster, cheaper, and more effective than extending the grid if we are going to bring safe, affordable electricity to the 700 million Africans who right now do not have access. GCF came in with $20 million as well as a $5 million technical assistance grant. The $20 million was equity under its private sector facility. And so first lesson, very clear goals, real partnership around the way that we operated. By the time that we saw disbursement a year ago, August, we were ready with pipelines, so we were able to move very quickly. We invested $14.7 million into 3 companies. Those companies then in turn leveraged another $55 million into those companies, off-grid solar, household systems, and a financing company. And together, already those companies have brought electricity to 1.9 million people, diverted 150,000 tons of carbon. We've got very strong metrics in place. There's been real partnership in terms of even being pushed by GCF. When we were talking about the technical assistance grant facility, GCF asked us, and I think this came from the board, which was exciting, what happens if one of the companies goes bankrupt in a private sector facility? Do you just walk away after low-income people have their systems in place? And while we might write off that company, what we agreed is that we would have technical assistance money as insurance, so that even if a low-income family, the company that was serving a low-income family goes belly up, that company will be serviced into the future. This is something we're now using when we talk about other types of for-profit initiatives and impact investments that are being built. And it really came out of the second real principle that we've seen in working with Green Climate is partnership, honesty, creativity around how the different funds are structured. Our NDAs, again, through real communication, have helped us understand the stresses that they feel in needing to report to government their outcomes. And so those have been very helpful to us because they've actually enabled us to have real relationships with Rwanda and Kenya where this facility operates, so that we can talk very honestly with government through the NDAs about tariff policies and other kinds of ways of working together. The GCF has helped troubleshoot with us as we have built this, and we're very excited to be moving very quickly now in investing with the partnership of GCF, with the partnership of the NDAs, with partnership of the governments of Rwanda and Kenya, very specifically betting on the private sector for off-grid electricity. And so we couldn't feel prouder. We couldn't feel more excited, because when we talk to other entities about GCF, and we use words like creative, partnership, trust building, we often get the feedback that these are not words that always get associated with DFIs. And so I think that this has been a real way of setting a different kind of standard for having clear goals, real partnership, open communications, creativity, and trust building that we certainly will work hard to do our part of the bargain and hopefully make GCF proud on the other side. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those compliments. Let me call on Ms. Raj again from NABARD to also give us their perspective.
Good evening, everybody. I'm representing NABARD, which is the Direct Access for India, the national implementing entity from India. A little bit I will tell you about my organization because it's slightly different. Although the name bank is there, it's a development bank of India. We don't lend directly, but we lend to the government and to the banks. And also we do simultaneously, apart from this credit function, the development role, whether it is in terms of institutional development or telling the bankers what can happen, what cannot happen, experiment ourselves, then mainstream that in the banking. That's our job. And also, we do a little bit of policy advocacy to Government of India and the provisional governments also. We are present all over the country, and the main, I would say, the focus of our programs is it involves the people directly. You know, we have 150,000 farmers clubs, which are, voluntary groups of farmers, and we have 3,000 farmer producer organizations, which we have promoted, and 5,000 civil societies. We work through them because we work in the field also, as I said, for the development aspects, and 7.5 million self-help groups of women. Each self-help group contains 12 to 15 women on an average. These are, again, informal groups. Now, why are we engaging with GCF? All of you know that India is committed to building a very climate resilient economy and low-emission pathways. And the climate change adversely impacts the rural livelihoods and the rural financial system. So we are trying to catalyze the climate action since we work in the rural areas. And NABARD's mandate is also about sustainable development and the resilience building. The advantages of working with GCF, knowledge and financial resources we get, and experiential learning. Like today, it has been very nice to hear so many case studies coming up. Then institutional building, as well as the technology transfer, because technology access is very important for climate action, especially in case of the developing countries. Now, the key learnings for us, see, if anyone who wants to get accredited understands the processes and the policies, what is required by GCF, the process of accreditation becomes very easy. So that is very important before anyone applies, if they understand. And NABARD has been facilitating this for the neighboring countries also, so that the accreditation process for the neighboring countries also, since we have gone through the process, we share our experience with them. Then stakeholders' engagement is, again, very, very important. This is one of the key learnings. Many times what happens when the concept is prepared, the concept note is prepared, or the DPR is prepared, the stakeholder consultation, especially at the, the community level, is absent. So that's something very, very important. That's one of the learnings. And capacity building at all the levels is very important. For all the stakeholders, that's one of the big challenges also for us. And community participation, see, NABARD's, most of the programs, as I said earlier, is based on community participation. That was probably one of the reasons, we could get the accreditation quite quickly. Then designing of innovative financial instruments is one of the things that we learn, as we go along. When we start talking to the people, the stakeholders, we work with the community, what we find is climate finance is not vanilla financing. We need maybe blended products. We need a different kind of innovations in financing. So that is something I think even, I would request GCF, maybe, you should consider some more flexible climate products than what you have right now. Could be, other countries also, similar kind of challenges. Then the key challenges, as I said, stakeholders' capacity building, because many times development, pure vanilla development, and the climate element, these two, the people are not able to distinguish, and these two have a relationship, but how do we relate that? That is one. And how do we, the ideas, the ideation, how do we convert it into, the PCN and the DPR state so that, it becomes easy for the GCF board to consider? These are some of the challenges we have. So the readiness support is very, very critical. And maybe broadening the readiness support also by GCF as one request, which I would place. Now, again, another aspect is maybe the projects and the development process, these are there, like elements of environmental, social, and the gender aspects, but specifically mentioning them putting them on the paper and as a policy and the implementation part, that is probably another challenge for us. Then cost of finance also is an issue. That's why maybe we do need some more innovations in the financial products. Then a programmatic approach rather than the individual project approach would probably help. This our with little experience of whatever we have been as direct access entity. This is our view from NABARD. Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was briefly our experience as direct access entity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, we have Terry Mccallion from EBRD.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for all those presentations. So I'm from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and just very quickly, we're the bank that was set up after the collapse of the Soviet Union in order to help with the transition from communism to market economy. I think this is somewhat relevant because we've had at the bank an energy efficiency financing team since 1994. So this is quite remarkable. It was a function of those markets that we were set up to deal with. And it means that I think we were very, very, very well equipped to deal with the challenge of climate change and climate finance. I can repeat all the words that Jacqueline used about our relationship with the Green Climate Fund. I think together we have a partnership that's really focused on transformational change that has good impact on CO2 emission reductions and builds climate resilient economies through financing projects from the ground up. We already have 5 frameworks or projects approved. I'm going to focus on 3 of them today because these 3 all now have got funded activity agreements signed, so we're under implementation. The biggest one I think was signed today, and each one is quite different. We have one that focuses on energy efficiency, one that focuses on renewable energy, and one that focuses on climate resilience. So we're addressing all of the different areas here, I think, as best we can. Randa talked a little bit about the first one, and this is a program where we provide funding with parallel co-financing from the Green Climate Fund through local private sector banks in all of those regions. I think there's 10 countries across that region of the Caucasus, the Balkans, Central Eastern Europe, and North Africa and beyond. Now, the reason that I think that this model is really, really important is that what we're doing here is we're actually buying a distribution capacity for financing. We're using the loan officers in every branch of every bank in the countries that we work with to work with their clients to open up access to funding, but also to open up and allow them to access advice about energy efficiency and the measures that they can pursue in order to save energy. So I think that's really important. And what we do over time is we build up the skills in the bank and we leave a legacy so that when the EBRD as a public bank walks away, the loan officers are there and they know how to deal with these things without EBRD or Green Climate Fund financing going forward. So I think that's very important. The second one on renewables is in Egypt. And Egypt is a country where there's a lot of sunshine, there's a lot of wind, but there's a very low level of market penetration of renewable energy technologies. And the technical potential clearly is there. The regulatory framework is also there. But one of the enemies of getting money to projects is not having a track record, and a good track record. Of course, a bad track record is a disaster. What we will manage to do here is finance about 600 megawatts of renewable energy capacity between probably solar and wind. We've already signed 8 transactions since we signed the FAA in September, and it's a mixture of wind and solar. That's going to save, or not those 8 deals, but when we've implemented this project in its entirety, it's going to deliver not just the capacity on the ground, but it's going to prove the track record of being able to project finance these things. And again, it'll be an opportunity for the climate finance community to step back and leave it more to the private sector to kick in. It's also very important today because there's a huge funding gap for these projects. So if we would not be able to mobilize private sector co-financing at the minute And this is one of the reasons it's essential for the Green Climate Fund to have been our partner in this deal. The third one is about climate resilience, and this is a project in Morocco that's really improving the climate resilience of agricultural systems and building an effective irrigation network and switching from water being taken from the aquifer to being diverted on the surface and used more effectively and efficiently. And that on its own will save something like 11 million cubic meters of water. So the reason that these things are, I think, all very important is that we have to prove these concepts. We have to open up these markets. Then we can sort of pilot and prove and then step back and watch as the market scales these things up. We have to add value. The value here, I think, jointly to all of us, is that as a result of the 5 programs, there'll be about 70 million tons of CO2 saved, significant number, and the 11 million cubic meters of water that I mentioned. We'll help to open up markets, but we'll also get the private sector mobilized on the ground and, you know, working away at the climate agenda long after we move on and leave. The Prime Minister mentioned earlier about being careful about not letting perfection be the enemy of good. I think it's really, really important that you get started with implementation. It's really important that you've got good monitoring, reporting, and verification systems as well. But sometimes, you know, you've really, if the opening line when you're trying to do a deal with a new client is, how are you going to report? You don't get the door open, so you've got to be pragmatic, you've got to be practical, and what we've done together with the Green Climate Fund is we've found a good balance in terms of how to deliver this financing. We've been able to deliver, I think, good gender and inclusiveness and good stakeholder engagement in the way that all of these projects have been put together, and that's something that we want to do going forward. So, you know, my message really is the Green Climate Fund it's open for business. We've got a very good partnership. The money is getting to investments that reduce CO2 already and save water and make infrastructure more resilient. Looking forward, I hope that we can do more energy efficiency, especially in industry. We can address the area of green cities, and we can sort of crack this challenge of how to finance a supply chain so that all of the supply chain becomes a low carbon supply chain. So thanks very much. I'd leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's give all of them, all the panelists, another round of applause. I think they've given us quite a rich presentation, and they've also given us lessons learned. From the GCF Secretariat, I think we also have very interesting considerations in terms of how we deal with other entities and countries in the future. Terry would be leaving us very soon because he has a flight to catch up. So I will now open the floor for questions. Let us have 4 questions for the first round, and then we can see based on timing. Floor is open. Can we have the mic to him? Please let us introduce yourself and then ask the question. If you have any question for Terry, please do so before he leaves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Richard Calland. I'm a law professor down in Cape Town, and I run a small think tank called the African Climate Finance Hub. And we've been watching the GCF with considerable interest over the last couple of years. And the points I wanted to make, or the questions, were really probably addressed to the co-chair, Mr. Mcdonald, but he's gone, which puts me in a slightly difficult position. But I'm going to press on anyway, in the hope that maybe one of the panelists would respond, and or Mr. Bamsey when he makes his closing remarks. The first point really is around what is the unique distinguishing feature of the GCF, because much of what I've heard tonight is interesting and impressive in many ways, but one's left with a kind of lingering doubt or question. What really sets it apart? What would be the difference if it wasn't there? Would it really make a difference to projects in Africa? And Jacqueline, you've partly answered that, and some of you have suggested some part of the answer, but I'd really like to be convinced so that if I was held up in a lift with a gun to my head, I could defend it to, you know, with the bottom of my heart. The second point, which is perhaps related, is around governance, and lingering questions there about the integrity of the decision-making process, on the conspicuous lack of absence in the board, at least, one that appears around what is the vision and strategy and business model of the organisation, and a sort of question mark around whether it's optimum. and whether it shouldn't in fact be strengthened. And one has some thoughts around that, but I certainly would welcome other feelings around that. Is this a body that's working at its fullest strength in terms of governance? Is it really fit for purpose? And can it deliver the kind of paradigm-shifting change we need? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Okay. Thank you, Terry. So, any other? Give the mic. Terry is leaving. Thank you very much for your time. Look forward to seeing you again. Yes, please.
Hola. Sí. Soy Robert Guimaraes de la Amazonía de Perú. He escuchado todas las intervenciones y estoy bastante sorprendido. Pero hay todavía barreras de cómo estos fondos que manejan los estados nacionales puedan llegar efectivamente a los pueblos indígenas.
I'm Robert Guimaraes from the Peruvian Amazon, and I'm very surprised how are barriers, how these funds can effectively arrive to the countries, to the indigenous peoples of the countries.
Vengo de un territorio afectado por la expansión del monocultivo de palma. No necesitamos muchos millones para titular nuestro territorio.
I come from an indigenous territory which is affected by agriculture with oil palm, and we don't need millions of dollars for getting titles, for title our lands.
Bueno, estas son las barreras entre el Fondo Verde y cómo los pueblos indígenas de la cuenca amazónica pueden tener acceso a ella. Muchas gracias.
These are the barriers between the Green Climate Fund and how indigenous peoples of this region can benefit from the fund, because apparently these funds are not being used for the title process of their lands.
Thank you for those observations and comments. We at the level of the fund are in the process of finalizing the indigenous people's policy. As I said, all our processes are all inclusive, country driven, and we would ensure that the indigenous people play a key role in accessing the funds, and all the projects that are being implemented at national level take into account their concerns and they benefit from them. Next. Can we have the mic here, please? Yeah, okay, give it to her and then, madam.
Yeah, good evening, and thank you so much for very impressive presentations and especially the examples of different projects. My name is Arjuman. I'm from Pakistan, and I'm working with the Swiss organization called Helvetas. We heard in the Prime Minister's speech that we don't have time to wait. I mean, you've taken the example of islands. So I was wondering about the examples of the projects that we heard, how much time it took you from the concept until the project was really materialized and fielded. And this goes in connection with the earlier question from our friend on the process itself of the Green Climate Fund, where the intention is absolutely, of course, highly appreciable. But in terms of process, are there any lessons above the project? I would say here at this level, what are the lessons that Green Climate Fund Secretariat has learned for itself on how to improvise the process, how to improve the process? And two things come to my mind. One is this whole gestation period until the project really can be fielded, because we cannot wait. Many priorities are really urgent. And the second is to do with the transparency of the process, because when the idea is approved from the country and is analyzed at the secretariat level, how do you assess and judge the plausibility of the project, that this is really needed and this is a bigger priority than the other and would be given a due attention? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the last for this first round of questions? You not? Okay, let's answer this these two questions first. The first one is on the uniqueness of the Green Climate Fund. I know our Executive Director, Howard Bense, is here. During maybe his closing remarks, he would delve into it. But first of all, I would like to tell you that the Green Climate Fund is unique in the sense that it is country-driven, and one of the key aspects that we look at is the risk that we take in terms of the private sector. We go that extra mile of de-risking the private sector, and then we have equity loans, grants as really a way of incentivizing the private sector. Now, we are unique in the sense that we are addressing low-emission climate resilient development strategies, and we are looking at projects that are transformational. At the level of the country, there needs to be inclusiveness. You need to consider the gender, the indigenous people as part of the policies that are coming, the sustainable development aspect. We consider sustainable development both in terms of environmental integrity and also financial sustainability. We look at the efficiency and effectiveness both in terms of finance, in terms of social and environmental safeguards. So we have a broad spectrum of areas that we do differently from any other multilateral funds. This is where we are unique. And again, everything that we do emanates from the countries. The countries would have to tell us that this is the priority, and that answers part of the question from the last speaker in terms of the transparency. What comes to us goes through the national designated entity who would provide a letter of no objection. And that is a demonstration that it is in line with their priorities. You've heard our colleague from Colombia saying that they have a process of establishing the no objection process. So they have a committee that reviews this. So whoever is in the committee is representing either an institution or an NGO. So that is where the country ownership lies. And we are providing them with an avenue for them to really have a broad-based stakeholder consultation process. Now, when the proposals come to us, we also look at all those things to tick here and there to ensure that they are aligned with our investment criteria and our objectives. You asked about how long it takes. I think the panelists would tell you how long it took, but you need to also take into consideration that this is a secretariat that was established just 2 years ago. We were operational within 2 years. The staffing had to be filled gradually, but again, we are not here to blow our own trumpets, but I think the general public would tell us how far we have performed, and the manifestation is here for you to see based on what they have told you. But I don't want to take the floor for too much. I would allow the panelists to answer some of the questions that relate to their experiences. The floor is open, please. Prime Minister.
Well, thank you very much. I think you, on behalf of the Secretariat of GCF, sort of responded partly, but I want to pick up on the point about ownership, because this is important. This is a mechanism that is set by the parties, and the parties to the convention, now the Paris Agreement. And of course, I appreciate the work of the Secretariat. But this fund is not owned by the Secretariat. The fund is to serve the interests of the parties to the Paris Agreement and the Convention on Climate Change. It's a mechanism that is provided there. And ownership, I mean, at the international level, it is the parties' fund. If we want to sack the Secretariat, we tell them. Because if they don't perform to the expectations of the parties, we give directives and directions. at the national level, in the case of Tuvalu, we have to make sure the projects are owned by Tuvalu, not driven by the donors, because it is not a donors fund. And therefore, in the case of Tuvalu, we've set a resilience building plan owned by Tuvalu and driven by Tuvalu. The priorities are set by Tuvalu based on its own policies, sustainable development policy. It's part of the also implementation plans of the SDGs of Tuvalu. And I think that is critical, very, very important. One point, final point that I want to say, I appreciate the efforts to seek the involvement of the private sector and so on and so forth. But the fund is to respond to the needs of developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. For Tuvalu, it cannot be loans. It is to respond to the impacts of vulnerable countries that are clearly specified. Developed countries are not eligible, as you know very well, both in the Paris Agreement, but also in the Convention, also the Kyoto Protocol. So I think we need to keep that well secured in our understanding, but I welcome the opportunities for partnerships and for private sector. And for the other facility that I also need to emphasize is the possibility of insurance partnerships to deal with the loss and damage that is beyond and above the adaptation needs of vulnerable countries like Tuvalu. On urgency, yes, absolutely. For Tuvalu, we didn't have to go to do the readiness. We skip it, and we decided on our own to go for funding of adaptation, because that is critical, not enabling funding. We need to go to adaptation. That's why I said, let's put our heads together, all my experts, let's draft our own proposal and go straight to full funding. And I want to acknowledge the help and the work of the GCF. I hope they will continue that tradition of helping vulnerable countries like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yuan, can you tell us how you approach the indigenous people as part of your project when you did the consultation?
Yeah, for sure. Right now we're advancing in the implementation of a project that is called Vision Amazonia. It's a project that, of course, given the region that we're going to tackle, its inhabitants are from indigenous background. So that's the major one of the major efforts we're doing in order to include indigenous people in the execution of environmental sustainability projects. That vision and that project is not funded through GCF, but of course we're very looking for working with those communities in order to improve our portfolio of projects that should be presented to the GCF. Also, I would like to give my 2 cents in the uniqueness of GCF. I believe that beyond the funding, in our experience, there was a positive externality of working with GCF. In Colombia, we have very good capabilities regarding public policy design. So we make good plans. We design very good policies on paper. We have many laws and decrees in many sectors. But what we lack is very strong capabilities to structure and execute concrete projects. So all this process of going through the process, of the GCF has increased our capabilities in order to structure projects. And another positive externality is that we have to measure the results, because sometimes many middle-income countries really only look for the funding, right? But after you get the funding, you don't have metrics and concrete metrics that show you how you're complying with the policy objectives. So I believe that beyond access to funding, that this process has improved our project structuring capabilities.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Just a minute, and then we go to the next round.
Great. Just to add, I really appreciated the question, and it made me think about the fact that GCF is still really a startup in its third year. And in a way, the questions that you're asking could also be thought of as more proactive. Because when I think about, I've talked about what I thought were the real unique qualities, and I didn't say, even to the point where once we had investments in the ground, really quite uniquely coming to visit and see what those investments were translating into. I think there's an opportunity being proactive in this moment of so much division, where there's even private sector. We talk the game of private sector and government and civil society all working together, and we don't see that happening enough. And GCF actually has different facilities that enable that. And I actually think in a funny way it's related to the question about indigenous communities. When we looked at this facility with 55 million raised so far, it didn't feel that significant, particularly when you hear the numbers that are often bandied around, even at COP, that we need trillions of dollars to go into energy access. Well, the truth is, we need about $45 billion a year for universal energy access. There's only about $6 billion that's allocated to sub-Saharan Africa. And only about $200 million a year is going into equity investments in private sector companies. So when you look at a $20 million investment from GCF, that's really significant. And so when I think about the future, is there a communications role as well to bring others on board and say, not only do we need more innovative financing and a lot more of it, but we need financing that is specifically around the poor, specifically around averting long-term climate crisis. And the thing about off-grid is that it does both. So I think that there's a proactive possible response there. And in that same vein, when I listen to that very good question about the indigenous peoples, we are not going to reach post-conflict communities and indigenous communities and ask them, who are bearing the brunt of climate change, to play business as usual. And so are there really imaginative financing vehicles that are grant-based but equity-oriented? And I think GCF has the kind of innovative team that will listen and build those kinds of facilities, recognizing that these are tensions that we have to hold of governments and the private sector trying to find ways to work together with a real sense of accountability to the general public. It's not easy work. Change isn't easy. And so I just wanted to throw that in. As someone who started many organizations, those first three years are unwieldy. To have done it in the way that they've done it is, I take my hat off.
Thank you. We're almost running out of time. Can I take 2 more questions and then we close? Okay. Let me call on the Executive Director, Howard Bamsi, to give his closing remarks. Howard, please.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. Thank you very much for coming tonight to listen to a story about partnership. All organisations and all people, all individuals, can't really achieve their aspirations without partners, but few organisations are as utterly dependent on our partners as the GCF. We literally could do nothing without them, and tonight you've heard from some of our partners. I think their stories are not unusual amongst our partners. They're different, they've had different experiences, they're serving different communities, but there's a common sense of purpose, a common commitment to serving those communities, and in serving them, to serving the global community with an effective long-term response to climate change. We're very proud of our partners. We're proud of those you've heard from this evening. We're proud to work with them. We're proud of all of the other partners, and indeed we'll be signing partnership agreements with 8 partners during this COP alone. So there's a process of acceleration in our activity. There's a process of acceleration in the way we are dealing with the proposals that people bring to us. Our board recently agreed to expand our capacity in the Secretariat to give us greater opportunity to work with our partners to serve their communities and their countries and the global response to the climate problem. So I come back to, I guess, the first observation about the GCF. I really don't have anything more to add to the question of what's unique. I think, except a personal story perhaps, years ago when I was a negotiator, I argued that we didn't need a new fund. And the reason I'm here now is because I am sure that there is something truly unique about the mandate, the purpose, the focus, the way we work with countries, ensuring that everything we do is genuinely fulfilling their aspirations. That's truly unique in my experience amongst international organisations. It's not, no one constituent of what we do is unique, but putting it all together, I think the GCF serves a uniquely valuable purpose in the climate change response. That's my conviction, that's why I'm here, and I think I speak for most of my colleagues in the Secretariat and indeed for many of our board members. Now, there's no sense in pretending that somehow we're perfect, because obviously we're not, and I think the Prime Minister said earlier, made that comment, that if you're waiting for the perfect, then you won't get anything done. And there are many ways in which the operations of the GCF could be improved. The Secretariat's working to improve what we can of our responsibility. I'm sure there are ways in which the workings of the board could be improved. But the board reflects the organisation that created it, the Conference of Parties. The board is the Conference of Parties in miniature. So it will never be, in its constituents, the sort of board that manages companies and banks. That's not its role, and that's not where it comes from. We are accountable to the Conference of Parties, the board and the Secretariat. Each year we follow guidance from the Conference of Parties. That's our milieu. So they're our partners. The parties to the convention are our partners. Our accredited entities are our partners, but ultimately it's the countries we serve in the way we serve them who are our partners, and we've had representatives tonight from some of those countries we serve. So we are an organisation that is founded on partnership, and I am sure that as our range of partners expands, as our range of activities with our partners expands, we will be able to fulfil, in a way that perhaps will become more obvious over time, the unique purpose of the GCF. We have no time now to explore the background to our foundation, but I think it does tell the story of why we are here. And while we're here, I'm sure I speak for all of our partners, as well as for my colleagues in the Secretariat, as well as for the board we try to serve as well as we can. I speak for all of us, I'm sure, in saying that we will pursue that mandate to the best of our capacity. We can do that effectively only with our partners, and I thank those who've been here tonight, those of our partners, each one of them uniquely important to us and uniquely important to the country they serve. We thank them, I thank them, and we look forward to working more with them and more with the other partners, the accredited entities, the countries that all of us working together can fulfil the purpose, I believe, of the Green Climate Fund. So with that, I thank you all for coming tonight. I hope that you've learnt a little more about the way we're working, a little more about the development of the fund in the 2 years since it began committing to project activity. And I hope you will stay with us and keep providing us with the sort of feedback that helps us improve the way we work. That's important, I think, for us and for our partners, and it's a constituent of our capacity to fulfil our mandate. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. That concludes this segment. We want to take this opportunity to thank all our panelists. Thank you.